let me just say welcome. First of all, thank you for being here. These are busy times. We're getting close to holidays, of course. So thank you for taking the time to take part in this, what I think is an important discussion. Let me say a couple of things as we jump into a discussion about Abraham Lincoln. And I would say, first of all, why Abraham Lincoln? Because there was some anxiety about, given current events, let's put it that way, about doing something on Abraham Lincoln. If we're going to be candid about Lincoln, we have to acknowledge that there are some sentiments and some statements from his past that are simply out of touch, inappropriate, and downright wrong. We might say in any day and age, but certainly in this day and age. I'm not unaware of those comments and those even some policies of Abraham Lincoln's, but I want to make a defense of Abraham Lincoln and why I still think it's worth our time to use him as a role model, or why I'd like to make the case to you today that he is a role model, especially for you and me as managers or soon to be managers and leaders in the public sector. First, I believe that if we are going to eliminate people that we might use as role models when we find things that we are uncomfortable with from their past, we will soon be out of heroes. And I mean that from A to Z with all people from history. And so I still would recommend to you that where we can, we take what we can from historical figures, and you take what's good and discard what's bad. I still think that is useful to us. The other thing I would say, maybe in defense of Lincoln, is that he's got, despite some, certainly in maybe particularly the debates with Stephen Douglas, what we know as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where he said some of these things, they are inconsistent. Let me put it this way. They are inconsistent to some degree with how he treated individuals. For example, Frederick Douglass recalls meeting President Lincoln at the White House and reports how he had never been treated with more respect and kindness by someone, and how that really shocked him. Frederick Douglass was not always pleased with the president. He thought him kind of dilatory or kind of a laggard as it related to abolition and to using black troops in the Union Army, but ultimately came to appreciate Lincoln the man. And even after his second inaugural at the White House, made room, let kind of Frederick Douglass cut in line and say, "What do you think of my speech?" And Frederick Douglass said, I'm not qualified to talk about that. And he said, "No, I value your opinion as much as anybody's." And anyway, so let's not discard all of historical figures. The second thing, in the last two off-the-shelf series that we've done, Rick Murdoch and J.J. Acker very kindly have referred to me as a Lincoln expert. And while my dissertation and my research is on Lincoln, and though I speak to Lincoln and about Lincoln to groups and participants all over the country, I'm not comfortable calling myself a Lincoln expert. I'm not a historian. I would rather be considered, and even this is a stretch, right? But if someone were to say I'm expert in anything, I'd like to be considered an expert in leadership and management development. And I have seen through my research how Lincoln is a worthwhile model of some things that I deem important for those interested in improving their leadership. And that brings us to our conversation today. The other thing I'm going to apologize for quickly is when we're talking about history, we don't have video to show. We have a lot of writing. So one of the cardinal sins of using this kind of medium is you don't want to be too text heavy. Some of this is going to be text heavy. Bear with me with that, Ken. I think you'll see how fascinating Lincoln is as a leadership role model. So we've got kind of the Lincoln myth versus the reality. What you see here is the Tower of Books at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It's because there have been over, depending on your estimate, 15,000 to 16,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. Really good histories to really bad histories. And this Tower of Books kind of acknowledges that there's only one person who's had more written about them than Abraham Lincoln. And you can probably guess that's Jesus Christ. And so it's really a remarkable volume of literature out there on Lincoln. And there are, of course, some myths. Anytime I meet with the group live, I ask the group to raise their hands. How many of you have read a book on Abraham Lincoln. See how many raise their hands. I'm like, how many of you raise your hands have seen Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter? And, you know, some hands kind of go up sheepishly, right? And he's used in everything. If you want to sell a product, you use Abraham Lincoln. If you want to make a movie, you put Lincoln in there, right? Think Bill and Ted's. Here he is, kind of, we treat him as this sort of superhero figure with Captain America and Spider-Man, remarkably. So what we want to do is dispel some of the myth about Lincoln and get to some of the reality. And I want to talk about Lincoln's character very quickly here. You know, one of the maybe the most common stories shared about Lincoln, perhaps apocryphal. There's debate among Lincoln scholars about this, but it's so Lincoln-esque in its nature that it's still shared, often, including by some very renowned historians. It comes from the Lincoln-Douglas debates when Lincoln was running for the Senate seat in Illinois in 1858. Well, he was going against Stephen Douglas. Well, in 1858, as in our day, if you could label, the terms we'd use in our day is to call someone a flip-flopper. You know, we just had a political, a presidential campaign and election. If you can nail someone with the flip-flopper label, that's hard to shake. That's pretty damning. Well, that was the same case in 1858. And Stephen Douglas said to these people in Illinois, as they went on these 7 kind of rural towns around Illinois having these remarkable debates, he said, you guys, Lincoln is two-faced. He's telling the people of northern Illinois, which had very different sentiments on slavery, different things than he's telling you people here in southern Illinois, which is more pro-slavery. He's two-faced. He's telling you different things. Now, Lincoln, one thing we know about him, quite frankly, is that he was homely. He knew this. He was told this often, of course, and people made fun of it from a very early age. He was awkwardly built. He was kind of all arms and legs, and he was 6'4", which was gigantic at the time, and he just was kind of homely. Well, think of Lincoln's character here, maybe what we'd call his emotional intelligence. He gets this very harsh political insult hurled at him. Stephen Douglas says, well, you're two-faced. Different debates than we have today went for like an hour, someone would speak, then you have an hour and a half response, and the person who first spoke has an hour response. Lincoln just sits there and absorbs this, doesn't get angry, doesn't say, oh, I'm going to lash out at Stephen Douglas here, absorbs this comment, gets up when it's his turn, and simply says to the thousands listening in his very high, twangy voice, says, I leave it to the audience. My opponent has called me two-faced, and I leave it to the audience. If I had another face, would I come out in public with this one? And of course, they just erupt in laughter and love him for that kind of self-deprecation. And despite this political insult hurled at him, he wins the point, so to speak, wins the debate on that pivot point. Again, perhaps apocryphal, but very Lincoln-esque in his humor. This is kind of who Lincoln was. So let's get to who Lincoln is. And I want to share with you, if you will, quickly, why Lincoln for you as public administrators. When we advertised this webinar, we said why specifically he's a role model for public managers. And so again, I talked to groups of different industries about Lincoln as a leadership role model, but my research, to be honest with you, my original research is Lincoln as a role model for public managers. So bear with me as I make this case quickly with you today, okay? The first argument is your agencies, those of you listening right now, you are part of agencies that are institutions. Okay, they make up part of what is foundational to America's constitutional system. The public administration, as maligned as it is foundational to the effectiveness of our constitutional system. And in particular, you are foundational to Utah's constitutional system and part of what makes Utah great. Therefore, your agencies are worthy of preservation, okay? Preserving their integrity. Okay, now public sector leaders, that's you, or what we might call conservators, and that doesn't have anything to do with liberal or conservative. Okay, it's a different term altogether. You are leaders when you preserve the integrity of your agencies. And one thing you're going to hear me say a lot is preserving the integrity of your agencies. We'll define this here in a second. Includes a principled, in other words, mission-based, as well as a physical preservation. Your agencies have to exist. They have to have funding. They have to have legislative support. They have to have governor support if you're going to do all the good things that you do. Okay, so you have to do good things and you have to exist to do those good things. Okay, research shows heavily that managers and supervisors are critical to preserving institutional integrity, not just appointed position, not just elected officials. Okay, but you are critical to preserving institutional integrity and other important agency outcomes. When it is here's our next point. When it is the preservation of institutional integrity, physical and principled integrity, that drives or dictates how you manage others, you are acting as leaders. Okay, all of these will be fleshed out. Here's the connection. President Lincoln was trying to preserve the integrity of his institution, in this case, the Union. His job was to preserve the integrity of the Union, and this included a physical and principled integrity. He had to keep the Union whole, and he had to keep it intact in terms of its founding tenets found in the Declaration of Independence. Okay? Although an elected official, Lincoln, like many of you listening, now or in the future, was also a manager. And he had often challenging subordinates, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about. Therefore, Lincoln is a worthy role model because of what drove the management of his subordinates. What drove him was how to best preserve for him the Union in a physical and principled sense. That dictated how he dealt with difficult generals, difficult cabinet members. Okay, and that's why I need your help here as we talk about some of this history of Lincoln. How does this translate to you? Okay, so first of all, what's an institution? You can see there a definition by Dr. Terry, who kind of wrote the book on this institutional leadership. But your institution, your agencies, it's an organization, but it's more than that, right? It embodies cultural values. It's foundational to society. Societies are created and maintained through their institutions. Well, so are your agencies, believe it or not. Okay, so part of what we do to preserve institutional integrity is first we define for your agencies what institutional integrity is. What's your purpose? Okay, then you manage subordinates to that purpose, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. You have to surround yourselves with similarly committed and talented people. Whenever you can, you have to manage change and adapt. If we're going to survive and we're going to have physical integrity, if we're going to exist, you have to manage and adapt. And then you have to cultivate something. It's a new term that we'll spend some time talking about. You have to cultivate phronesis. It's a Greek term that translates roughly to practical wisdom, or maybe even prudence. But I like practical wisdom. Okay, now we're going to cover all of these. So to say that an institution, look on the right side here, to say that an institution has integrity, it's related to its distinctive competence. So you at UDOT, you at the Tax Commission, you at DNR, you at Health, you at USBE, you at whatever it is, you at Human Services, what is it that is a distinctive competence that you do that others cannot do, or that you do better than others? So to say that an institution has integrity is to suggest it is faithful to the functions, values, and a distinctive set of unifying principles that define its special competence. There are things that your agencies are designed to do, and and I keep going back to this, right? As much as we might be maligned by the public, you do things very well, not perfectly, but very well, that you should exist. There's a reason that despite most of our agencies costing taxpayer money, decision makers say they need to exist because it is foundational to Utah being a successful and worthwhile state to live in. Okay, so this is what we mean by preserving institutional integrity. Now, naval historian Craig Simons, who, if you ever watch the History Channel, you'll see him on there quite a bit, said Lincoln's particular genius, and this is going back to our second point. Once you've defined what your purpose is, or what institutional integrity means for you, and if we were doing a live training now, you would all be writing down, I'd be having you write down, okay, what is your distinctive competence? What is it that your agency does? Well, we don't have time for that, so I need you to think about this on your own. And then next step is manage your subordinates to that distinctive competence. That's the only thing that should dictate how you manage others. Look at what Craig Simons says here about Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's particular genius, the particular activity for which he was fit, was the ability to see the whole clearly, that purpose, and more importantly, to manage people around him in a sympathetic, compassionate, yet realistic way to move them in the direction that he believed was necessary. Lincoln cared about preserving the Union. He had this crisis that the nation had never faced. The Union itself, a small r, Republican, federal republic form of government, constitutional form of government, which was new to the world at the time, was in crisis. And he said, all that matters here, ego doesn't matter, other things don't matter. I've got to manage my generals, my cabinet members, towards accomplishing that preservation of this institution, this union. Same thing for you and me. And Craig Simons here says that's what he was good at. Okay, that's why he's a worthy role model. So here's our quick formula today. This is really ugly, by the way, but it'll make sense to you. First of all, preservation of institutional integrity. Remember, a physical, we have to exist. We have to have funding. We have to defend ourselves to those who would say we shouldn't exist. And a principled integrity. We have to do what we do better than anybody and efficiently and effectively. Plus what we'll call law of the situation, or phronesis, is practical wisdom. It's when these two things drive us as leaders and managers. That's what equals effective leadership in the public sector. Now, this is a terribly simple formula. That's okay. We're going to get into more depth with these things. Okay, so stay with me, and I'll revisit this formula quite a bit. So first of all, what do we mean by the law of the situation? Mary Parker Follett, who I just love and esteem because she was a genius. She's been called in, the prophet of management in later days. You saw see when she died, but she was so ahead of her time, and she never got the credit that she deserved. She never got the credit she deserved. Why? Well, she's a management theorist in the 20s and 30s, late 19th, early 20th century. But she was way ahead of her time. And she said the law of the situation, in other words, you've got a certain circumstance. That situation, rather than formal authority or anything else, should determine what you do. So I've adopted this law of the situation phrase, which a lot of people hear and they say, what does that even mean, Dan? I've adopted it because it takes ego out of our leadership. Right? And it takes other considerations out of our leadership other than, here are the facts. Here's what we're currently facing. Okay, what do we do? Now remember, it's law of the situation plus this phronesis. Okay, now phronesis is a term or practical wisdom introduced by Aristotle, who said that phronesis is this. Stay with me here. Virtue makes us aim at the right mark, and practical wisdom makes us take the right means. So the things that you're doing in your agencies, the public good that you're doing, okay, is virtuous. And the goals you have in your agencies or your teams or your divisions, departments, whatever it is, you're trying to accomplish good things, mission, purpose-based things. And that's virtuous and good, and that's the right mark, Aristotle would say. Now you need to combine that with knowing the best means to accomplish that good. That together is phronesis, or practical wisdom, right? A little more on this. William Tecumseh Sherman, anybody from the South here will know, he kind of blazed a trail, committed a lot of atrocities, we would say total war, in Georgia, as he went from Atlanta, torched Atlanta down to the sea, down to Savannah. Wasn't a fan of Abraham Lincoln's, okay? And yet he said after a while, at first he wasn't a fan, later he came to appreciate someone interviewing him. He said, of all the men I ever met, he learned this about Lincoln. He said he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other. Think about that for a second. And think about, I'm going to go back a bit, think about what we just saw from Aristotle. Virtue and taking aim at the right mark, that's Lincoln's goodness. Lincoln abhorred slavery from a very early age. Okay, he hated the injustice of slavery. Yet he was not a radical abolitionist, because he knew that would never get the task accomplished. His greatness was the political acumen or practical wisdom to get that accomplished while saving the Union. This seemingly impossible task. He had to save the Union and fight a bloody war to do it, while also abolishing slavery, starting to use black troops, and then ultimately being this force behind the 13th Amendment, which ultimately abolished slavery forever in the States. Okay, he combined those two things. This is a fascinating concept, you guys, is phronesis. Just a couple other thinkers on this, right? Practical wisdom, or phronesis, is the indispensable political skill of harmonizing principle and practice, or narrowing the gap between the possible and the actual. Here's the key one: between the real and the ideal. So you probably a lot of you got into your jobs with real high ambitions about the good you were going to do, and then red tape and other things kind of beat you down. Well, how can we best accomplish that ideal? What's the realistic way that we can accomplish that? That is phronesis, right? From Suprenant here, it combines the intellectual ability with character and experience necessary to make wise and sensible decisions in particular human situations, law of the situation. And that's why someone in 2008, they did some research, they said, we think phronesis may be think about this, the quintessential management virtue. Can you have these high ideals, and yet can you figure out the way to actually accomplish them? actually make them happen, not just have them in some sort of doctrinaire sense where you never actually get anything done. Okay. And can you also maintain those high ideals and not fall victim to cynicism and despair because you can't accomplish everything, right? That's the key here. So look at what Lincoln's purposes were. Lincoln said in his first, we didn't call it this then, but what we would call now maybe a State of the Union. The war continues, right? And he wants to get policies to suppress the in what he calls the insurrection. But he says, I have therefore, see in the italicized here, I have therefore in every case thought it proper to keep the integrity of the Union prominent as the primary object of the contest on our part. Lincoln knew it is the integrity of the Union, just like it is the integrity of your agencies that should be first and foremost. It should drive your leadership, okay, in a physical and principled sense. I love this. Given what we are going on with in his second State of the Union, with COVID and social unrest and political events, Lincoln understood that this would require new adaptive approaches to leadership and change management. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. You guys, we are in the stormy present right now. This occasion or the events right now are piled high with difficulty, and we must rise to the occasion. The case is new, certainly with COVID and the world outside right now, the case is new. So we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, in this case, disenthrall ourselves with what we've done before, and then we shall save our country. You recognize here that this is December 1862. Lincoln is making a case here for the Emancipation Proclamation, which would have the force of law a month later, on January 1, 1863. He's saying, you guys, I'm acting anew because our problems are new. He's trying to placate those that are mad at him in the North for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in the states then in rebellion. Okay, but he's saying, look, I'm going to try new things because we've never faced anything like this. To maintain the integrity of your agencies, you're facing a crises in some ways that no one alive really has ever really faced, right? Not maybe since the Spanish flu. And if you combine it with the political things going on, as well as some social unrest, not that these are bad things, but they're happening and they're challenges that we have to be ready to face. And then finally, what was Lincoln's purpose? And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this webinar today, you see it's November 19th, is when maybe the first or second most famous speech in American history. Lincoln's purpose was that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. In Lincoln's mind, that's what was at risk here. This was 87 years ago, 87-year-old experiment that the world was going to laugh at America when it says, we knew it couldn't work. Okay, monarchy was still the rule of the day then. And they were just waiting for America to crumble. And Lincoln's like, no, I've got to preserve the integrity of this union, of this institution, for the whole earth, not just for our sake, but because to prove that this grand experiment in a constitutional republic is not a failure. Okay, you can imagine the weight that he felt of that. Well, here's the weight for you right here. Look at Lincoln in June of 1860. He would be elected, of course, in November of 1860. Look at him near the end of his life, 2 months or so before he was assassinated in February 1865. If I were to label this image, I'd call it the price of leadership. If we're doing this live, I'd pause and allow you to reflect. Now, we might not feel the stresses that Lincoln did, but there are burdens and stress and anxieties and challenges that come when you accept a leadership role in your agencies. Is it worth it to you? Okay, it was worth it to Lincoln, but you can see the toll that this took on him physically in that 4-year period. Okay, so again, here's our formula. Stay with me. Preservation of institutional integrity in a physical and principled sense. The law of the situation plus this practical wisdom, or phronesis, great word, by the way, phronesis, that's what equals effective leadership. Now, we said you've got to know, I'm inviting you now to think about and even ask those around you, those that you manage, your peers, colleagues, what is institutional integrity for us? What does that mean for what we do on this team, in this department, in this division, right, in this, whatever it is, in this agency? Well, for Lincoln, he knew what that was. The government of the people, by the people, for the people should not perish from the earth, right? and that the foundational documents would more fully come to fruition. Well, the second tenet here is that you manage people to that purpose. And I want you to see how Lincoln did that. We're going to talk about some difficult employees, and we're going to go through this quickly, okay? Difficult employees that Lincoln had to manage. The first we're going to see there is George B. McClellan. That's think of, by the way, those of you that have managed here or anyplace else, have you ever had an employee that kind of just thinks you're an idiot and that you don't know what you're doing? The second we'll talk about is Salmon P. Chase, the employer colleague that thinks they should have your job. That's like, I should have been promoted, not you, and I should have your job. Okay, and then we'll look at John C. Fremont. His name is, there are Fremonts all over the West, towns, areas, counties, all over the West, because he was known as the Pathfinder, did a lot of good things in the West. But he's an employee that, have you ever had one that you're like, you're doing too much? You've got to overstep your bounds. Not that you're working too much, but that you're getting into things that are not part of your job description, and you need to stay off of it. Well, these are three difficult people, case studies that we'll look at with Lincoln and how he handled them. Okay, so the first, remember, managing subordinates to that purpose. Let me quickly give you a background of the war and George B. McClellan. The war was never supposed to last very long. Okay, Fort Sumter fell in mid-April. 1861, Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops, and they're like, okay, this war is going to be over quickly. We've got manufacturing, we've got more manpower in the Union, we're going to crush the Confederacy. First Battle of Bull Run, very close to the capital. People, by the way, this is so weird. People are like having picnics and viewing with whatever, binoculars, whatever kind of thing they had in the day to watch this battle. Think about that for a second. It was kind of a spectator sport. And the Union got drubbed. It was a drubbing. Okay, the Union got whipped. Well, the Union's starting to get scared here. They fire McDowell, who was the general at the time. They say, we got to bring in this guy McClellan. He's young, but man, he's amazing. He's talented. He couldn't be more opposite from Lincoln. Lincoln came from nothing. This guy was well-bred, came from, a patrician background, had the best education, really great career, promising career after he left West Point. He was an engineer, talented. Everyone said, oh, this is the guy. Well, he doesn't think very highly of Lincoln. In fact, he doesn't think very highly of anybody. He thinks he's the smartest guy in the world. Well, he gets made very early on, puts in this powerful position of general of the Army of the Potomac. Okay, the largest, the Union Army for all intents and purposes in the East, right? And now he has some talents. He is a great organizer and driller. He whips this, to his credit, he whips this army into shape. He gets them the supplies that he needs. He drills them. They do parades and other things. Everyone's like, oh, all of a sudden we have an army now. Because you got to keep in mind, the U.S. didn't really have a standing army as we would call it today, like we would think today in 1861. And so you have to organize one, and he was brilliant at that. The problem was, he was really good at putting on a show and making the soldiers feel proud of themselves and saying, oh, we're mighty, and then not fighting. Lincoln knew that the Union had more manpower, better manufacturing, and had to crush the rebellion, had to beat, eventually, Lee's army, Robert E. Lee's army. And McClellan was good at getting guys ready, but he'd be like, oh, we don't have enough supplies. Okay, oh, our horses are tired. Oh, they outnumber us. And he'd make excuses like they outnumber us. And usually, in one point, he said they have over 200,000 troops. They never, on any occasion, did the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, have more than 85,000. And on every occasion, McClellan's army outnumbered the Confederacy. On every occasion. Well, so this became really difficult. The other thing, of course, is that the army loved him. They loved him. He was talented. He made them feel good. He was charismatic, right? But he thought very little of Lincoln, called him an idiot. We have all these letters to his wife, right? They call him the original guerrilla, says he doesn't know what he's doing. I have to save the Union because this moron doesn't know what he's doing, right? And Lincoln was not oblivious to how McClellan thought of him or how little McClellan thought of him, okay? So at one point, let me just show you. I'm going to go back here first. I want to talk about these two snubs, okay? And I'm spending too long on this, but I have a real disdain for George B. McClellan. So let me just spend some time on him. At one point, he's a newly appointed, young general of the Army of the Potomac. And Lincoln wants to go see him. So they go to his residence in Washington, D.C., and Lincoln's got with him William Seward, the Secretary of State, as well as personal secretary John Hay. They go to McClellan's residence where they're supposed to meet him, and McClellan's not there. And the porter at the house says, well, I'm sorry, McClellan is attending a wedding. Well, Seward, Secretary of State Seward, and the personal secretary John Hay are incensed at this already. Lincoln says, it's fine, we'll wait. So they sit there in kind of this entrance area, and they're just sitting there for like a half hour. McClellan comes home. McClellan walks by. Think about this for a second. McClellan walks by, glances at them, doesn't say a word, and keeps on walking until he goes upstairs. And Lincoln and Seward and Hay are kind of like, okay, looking at each other. Another half hour goes by. This is the President of the United States and the Secretary of State. Okay, another half hour goes by. And the porter comes down and says, I'm sorry, gentlemen. General McClellan has retired for the evening. Okay, well, Hay is going to murder McClellan, and Seward is just as incensed. And Lincoln says, well, you know what? Now's not the time. What we're dealing with is too big right now to be worried about, points of etiquette. That's fine. Well, then on another occasion, Lincoln, who, although he seemed to not be bothered by the situation, no longer went to McClellan. He said, I've got a meeting with these war generals, Ohio, Indiana, or war governors of states that are in the Union, says, and McClellan, you need to come to this meeting. Well, McClellan just doesn't show. Okay, and doesn't send word that he's not going to be showing. Well, again, Lincoln is starting to get a little ticked off. And his personal secretary and others around him are starting to get really mad. And he says, you know what, never mind. I'll hold McClellan's horses. Okay, in other words, I'll be his attendant. I'll be his servant if he'll just bring us victory. What I care about is the integrity of this Union. I don't care that I know he mocks me. I don't care that he thinks little of me. I don't care that he's been insolent with these meetings and that sort of thing. If he brings us victories, that's what I care about. Okay? That's what I care about. Well, let me go here. Now, I told you again, there's a lot of text here, so stay with me. So on one occasion, McClellan does fight, and he gets, kind of whooped, as most did. For most of the war, you guys, up until Gettysburg, up until the Battle of Gettysburg, in the middle of the war, in early July 1863, the Confederacy is, you'll have to pardon the phrase, but the Confederacy is kicking the Union's butt. Despite the Union having more manpower, better manufacturing. One of the simple explanations is that the Confederacy got the more talented generals, right? Well, look at this letter. McClellan, partly because of his being slow to move and not acting quickly enough, makes all these excuses, okay? Look at what he says here. He talks about his men being overwhelmed, and I just needed more troops. I just needed more troops, even though he already had more than the enemy. Okay. He says, you got to send me more reinforcements, right? If I save this army now, okay, if I save this army now, I tell you plainly, I owe no thanks to you or any other persons in Washington. Look at the last line. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. Now, this was sent to Secretary of State Stanton officially, but Stanton and Lincoln were communicating, quite frankly, all day, every day, right? So first of all, you'll notice in this that it's McClellan is very much I can't be blamed. I can't be blamed for this, right? Well, let me tell you how incendiary this was. This was so incendiary, this telegraph, that the telegraph operator actually edited out the last line. We only saw this later. Stanton and Lincoln never saw you have done your best to sacrifice this army because it was so incendiary, so borderline treasonous that the telegraph operator's like, they're going to kill the messenger, right? But it was so insolent and insubordinate already that it's beyond reason for a general to say this to his commander-in-chief, right, and to the Secretary of War. Well, look at how Lincoln responds. Okay, look at how Lincoln responds. Save your army at all events. I'll send you reinforcements as fast as we can, but we need them for other things, including to protect the capital. Of course, they can't reach you today or tomorrow or the next. But he said, I haven't said you were ungenerous for saying you needed reinforcement. In other words, I never said, stop asking for reinforcements. He said, but I thought you were ungenerous in assuming that I did not send them as fast as I could. I feel any misfortune to you or your army quite as keenly as you feel it yourself. It is the nature of the case, and neither you nor the government that is to blame. How's that for emotional intelligence? How's that for managing subordinates despite their insolence and insubordination? Because right now he knew, remember, he was trying to get two things. McClellan was very good at organizing the army, and he had talent. He had tremendous talent, right? Also, the army loved him, so Lincoln had to be aware of that. Think phronesis, practically. He couldn't just be like, yeah, he's gone, because the army loved him. But also, Lincoln's starting to get pressure from Congress and from the Committee on the Execution of the War. It was called something else, right? To get rid of McClellan. Others are getting sick of him too, but Lincoln doesn't have anybody else. Lincoln doesn't have anybody else. He's asked some people to do this, okay? On another occasion, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but McClellan hands Lincoln a letter. Lincoln goes to visit him, actually. And by the way, it's really funny because the photographer back then, you had to stand still for the picture. And Lincoln, you can tell, is starting to get picture because he told his wife, he's like, oh, the photographer, White House photographer told us he's going to want to stand still. That's McClellan right there on the left. Stand still for the picture. And he tells his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, he says, I don't think McClellan's going to have any problem standing still. Like, that's all he does, right? He never fights. Anyway, so McClellan goes and visits the troops here, and McClellan hands him a letter. Now, McClellan is a Democrat. Lincoln is a Republican, newly formed party, a Republican. And McClellan's also like kind of pro-slavery. He doesn't care that slavery gets abolished. In fact, he hands Lincoln this letter that Lincoln reads and doesn't respond to, just puts in his pocket. But it was a letter that was totally inappropriate for the day. It wasn't on how to prosecute the war. In other words, hey, I think we should do this, move troops here, which would have been fine. It was a letter saying, this is what the war should be about, and this is what your policies should be. And they were all sort of Democrat policies of the day, okay? And totally inappropriate. Again, Lincoln says, I'm not going to respond to that. That's fine, okay? And he said to his secretary, look, he's acted badly in the matter, but we have to use the tools we have. I can't just fire him right now. The managers now or in the future who are listening to this, on occasion, you are going to want to fire some of your employees, and it will not be that easy, okay? So what can you do to work with the tools that you have? That's practical wisdom. That's the law of the situation. That's how it is in the public sector. Lincoln faced the same challenge. He said, I can't just get rid of him. There are other things to consider. Plus, I don't have other people who are willing to take command. And in fact, Senator Ben Wade, a radical Republican, comes to Lincoln and says, you've got to get rid of him. We're fed up. It's done. And Lincoln says, well, put yourself in my place for a moment, Senator Wade. If I relieve McClellan, whom do I put in command? And he says, anybody. And Lincoln says, yeah, anybody, quote, anybody will do for you, but not for me. I actually have to have somebody that I could put in there. I've tried with Burnside. He's chicken to do it. He doesn't want to do it. I've tried with this person, that person. They all refuse, okay? Now, ultimately, Lincoln does get rid of McClellan. The second thing, a law situation and phronesis here. When Lincoln gets a sense on one occasion that McClellan actually refused to go to the aid of another general, Lincoln got fed up. And then on another occasion, when McClellan finally got what we call a draw victory at the Battle of Antietam, bloodiest single day in the Civil War, the Battle of Antietam, which we would call a draw. And it was enough of a victory, though, that Lincoln said, okay, I can publicly announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, once it happened, Lincoln said, okay, I'm going to replace him, and replace him with Burnside. But it wasn't because he offended Lincoln. It wasn't because he was insubordinate. It's once he did something that was contrary to preserving institutional integrity, not supporting a fellow general who needed it. And once he could properly get rid of him and finally start trying to find people that would fight, Lincoln got rid of him. Well, what's our formula? Preservation of institutional integrity is the only thing that should matter. Consider the law of the situation and phronesis, practical wisdom, and then you've got effective leadership. And that's what it was with McClellan. You guys, we could go into, not that you care about this, but in my dissertation, the largest chapter by far in my dissertation is on McClellan. And I must admit, I have a personal vitriol for McClellan, and it's never that cut and dry. You could read other historians who are like, well, sometimes people are unfair to McClellan. I personally, he reminds me of like he would be the rich, snobby, good-looking kid in a 1980s movie where he's the villain. That's kind of how I see him, as weird as that sounds. Whereas Lincoln was ugly and poor and, but got himself up by his bootstraps to become president anyway. So, but there we see again how Lincoln managed this. Okay, and ultimately, of course, he would find his general that thought like he did, and that was Grant, and Grant's subordinate Sherman, who we saw earlier. So now, so we said you got to manage people towards the preservation of institutional integrity. That goes for you and me as well. You've got to assemble a talented team. Now, the most popular Lincoln book in the past 10 years, maybe the past 50 years in some ways, the most popular, most likely read Lincoln book, if you have read a Lincoln book, it's probably Doris Kearns Goodwin, Team of Rivals, right? Team of Rivals. It was all about how Lincoln, surprisingly, in one sense, gets the Republican nomination for president. The Democrat nominee was so fractured with Stephen Douglas, with the conservatives, with John C. Bell in the Deep South, and Breckinridge, kind of this more moderate Democrat. Lincoln wins without a popular vote, easily didn't win the popular vote, but beat the other guys, and so he gets elected president. Well, it was a shock that he won the Republican nomination. From Missouri, who was probably more popularly thought of. All these people lost out. Lincoln had a good strategy and said, I'm not going to be anyone's first choice at the nominating convention in Illinois. He said, I'm going to be everyone's second choice. And when no one gets enough votes to win the first ballot, it starts going, we're going to get them to jump to me instead of jump to Seward. So he, really strategic, really brilliant, wins the nomination. Okay. Well, much to everyone's surprise, he then starts putting these former opponents, his rivals, to use Goodwin's term, on his cabinet. And we're going to talk about Salmon P. Chase. By the way, my last name is Chase, no relation. By the way, you'll see why I say that in a second. He would end up, by the way, I just have to say this because I love this phrase. Seward was really reluctant to become a Secretary of State. Seward desperately wanted to be president. And he was reluctant to be Secretary of State until finally, ultimately, Seward and Lincoln became something like best friends. Seward, of course, had a remarkable resume, unlike Lincoln's. Really came from a really good background, unlike Lincoln. But they became best friends till ultimately, in early in Lincoln's presidency. It didn't take long. Seward wrote to his wife and said, kind of extolled his virtues and said, Lincoln is the best of us. He is the best of us. He saw after a while, he's like, he is remarkable. Okay. Well, Salmon P. Chase didn't feel that fondly about him. So Chase ran for the presidency, like I said, in 1860. And Chase was brilliant. And he was a more radical Republican. That's partly why he didn't win the nomination. He was a staunch abolitionist, and so he couldn't win. But anyway, he lost in 1860, agrees to become the Secretary of the Treasury. He wasn't he wasn't a money person, but he was so smart. Lincoln knew this, and Lincoln was definitely not a money guy, that he said, Chase will figure it out. And he did. Okay, but here's the problem. Lincoln was never popular until like August, September 1864. So the Civil War is going on for like 3 years almost before Lincoln becomes popular. He's despised in the Confederacy, of course. He's despised in the North. It seems like this is getting away from him. He's not talented enough. So Chase is like, aha, I'm going to be the next Republican nominee for president in 1864. Chase is not, or Lincoln's not oblivious to Chase, despite Chase being on his cabinet running for president. He's got connections, and people are telling him, hey, Chase is running for president, right? But Lincoln says this. People are like, you need to just get rid of him. But Lincoln being, remember, think phronesis, practical wisdom here, and law of the situation. He knows that if Chase wants to be president in 1864, he cannot put on his resume that he was a crappy Secretary of the Treasury. He has to be able to articulate that he was the one that got funding for the war and kept currency going, and things of that nature. And so Lincoln, of course, always had a story in his mind for a situation. He said, let me tell you the story of these people plowing a field back in Indiana, actually not even Illinois, but in Indiana. He said, this horse was plowing this field, and it was just running and running and running, plowing this field, doing great work. And the owner of the horse noticed that he had what he calls a chin fly on him. This fly was biting this horse, and that's what was making it run and work so hard. And the guy went in and, out of kindness to the horse, got rid of the fly. And the other guy said, you shouldn't have done that. That's what was making the horse go. Well, Lincoln, of course, said, the presidency is Chase's chin fly. What I care about is winning this war and preserving the integrity of the Union, keeping it whole in its principles and its founding documents, as well as actually surviving, right? And Chase is doing such a great job for me because that presidency is his chin fly. I'm not gonna flick it off yet. The only thing I'm going to consider about is he doing a good job? Well, think about this. Think about it from the other end. Here is a subordinate appointed position to Lincoln's cabinet. People are like, why don't you just quit? Why don't you just quit and start campaigning full time now? And you did a good job. You can put that. Look at what Chase said to a colleague about President Lincoln. And if you take nothing else away from this, it's if you and I could have this said about us by subordinates, that would be a massive victory. Look at this. Salmon P. Chase said, the president has always treated me with such personal kindness and always manifested such fairness and integrity of purpose. In other words, the only thing that Lincoln cares about is preserving the integrity of this union. And it's been foolproof without deviating from that. He says he's treating me with such kindness, fairness, and integrity of purpose that I've not found myself free to throw out my trust. I still trust him. This guy has got such integrity, so I still work on. That's remarkable. Okay. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this. We all have mixed motivations. Okay. But this is a remarkable thing that Salmon P. Chase is saying here. Well, how does this keep going? Well, there's what's called the Pomeroy Committee, because there's a senator from Kansas, a new state, right, that wants to get Chase as president. And so it's this Pomeroy Committee is this committee that's trying to get Chase to be the Republican nominee in 1864. And in 1864, it got leaked to the press. There was a pamphlet, basically like campaign materials that got leaked to the press. Look, Salmon P. Chase knew of the committee. In fact, someone said, well, Chase had to authorize the pamphlet. But Chase denied it vehemently, said, oh, President, you can't hold me accountable for what my friends are doing. I'm not behind this, right? And Chase sends Lincoln a letter apologizing, disavowing. And one thing that you did back then, right, is if you didn't get your way, you would offer a letter of resignation, and then the authority figure was supposed to reject it, okay? Well, when Chase wouldn't get his way, he would give a letter of recommendation. He did this 2 times already. Well, I don't like the way this is going. Here's my letter of recommendation. Excuse me. And Chase or Lincoln would say, no, okay, you get your way. I don't want your letter of resignation. Okay. So stay with me here. Okay. He gets one of these letters and he saying, hey, here's my resignation. I'm embarrassed by what happened with the Pomeroy Committee. And don't read this whole thing. But Lincoln says, look, I'm not oblivious to this. My friends tell me what's going on, and I don't ask, but they tell me it's fine. Look at the underlined portion here. This is where we get to preservation of institutional integrity. Whether, he's speaking to Chase, whether you shall remain at the head of the Treasury Department is a question I will not allow myself to consider from any standpoint other than my judgment of the public service. And in that view, I do not perceive an occasion for change. And so Lincoln would say earlier, in 1862, look, I'm not going to do anything with malice. Even though this guy's working behind me, he doesn't think he thought he should be president, still thinks he does. What we're dealing with here is too vast, too important for malicious dealing. I would suggest the same thing to you about your agencies. In your management, the only thing that should matter is the preservation of institutional integrity, okay? Now, ultimately, of course, there would become a time where the relationship with Chase and Lincoln got too strained. And Lincoln's like, I've got someone else who can be Secretary of the Treasury now, okay? So Chase, over something, again, he wanted to not have to take advice of some senators and other officials from New York and appointing a Treasury person there. And Lincoln's like, look, this is how we usually do it. Chase said, I'm not going to do it. If I have to do it, I resign. And to his surprise, Lincoln very quickly said, okay, I accept your resignation. Look at what he said, though, here in the bottom of the screen. Your resignation of the office of the Secretary of the Treasury sent me yesterday is accepted. Of all I have said in commendation of your ability and fidelity, I have nothing to unsay. I still think you're very talented. And yet we've reached a point of mutual embarrassment in our official relation, which it seems cannot be overcome or longer sustained. Well, how? Consistently with the public service. In other words, this is starting to hurt our efforts in preserving institutional integrity. I'm not doing this out of spite. And that's why Secretary of State Seward very early on in 1861 would say his magnanimity, right, his generosity of spirit is almost superhuman. Actual quote from William Seward, who was an enemy, who was a rival, right? We should say, who was a rival very early on in his relationship, said, oh, it's remarkable. It's almost superhuman. Now look at this. There was a fan of Salmon P. Chase's who worked in the Treasury Department, Lewis Chittenden, who freaked out. Was like, if you lose Chase, we're done. This is no good. And Lincoln responds to him and said, look, Lucius, there are reasons why I had to accept his resignation. But he said, there's not a man in the Union who would make as good a Chief Justice as Selma P. Chase. And if they have the opportunity, I'm going to make him Chief Justice of the United States, which he does after the election. After the 1864 election in November, Lincoln appoints Selma P. Chase, despite all of this, to Chief Justice of the United States. He liked his radical politics. And by the way, think phronesis here, he also wanted Chase campaigning for him. So he didn't give it to him before the election. He waited till after the election and said, okay, I'm going to make him Chief Justice. Look at what Lucius Chinden, who was mad at Lincoln and who loved Selma P. Chase, look at what he said. Lincoln must move upon a higher plane and be influenced by loftier motives than any man. Think about that as it relates to our leadership and our leadership ethics. Okay. Can this be said of you and me as managers now or in the future? That when anything we do with our people is to preserve institutional integrity, people say they're not doing this out of ego. What they care about, their loftier motives are the preservation of our agency here in the state of Utah, its integrity. Okay, remarkable sentiment. Okay, so remember our formula here. I'm not going to go over it here again because I want to get through this, our last example here. John C. Fremont. Here's some bar bet knowledge for you. John C. Fremont in 1856 was a celebrity and actually the first ever Republican candidate for the office of president. Okay, he lost. He lost to Buchanan in 1856, but he was famous, married a famous wife from a famous family. He loved celebrity. Okay, he blazed a trail, during the Mexican-American War and all through the West, and that's why you see these towns and counties and even, high schools named Fremont all over Utah, Idaho, California, Oregon, even Nevada, all these Fremonts everywhere. It was after this guy, okay? Well, there's some pressure to appoint him to an important position, so Lincoln kind of puts him in charge of Missouri. Now, Missouri is a border state, so the Civil War is dragging on. It's gone longer already. It's supposed to only last, 45 days or something like that, 75 days, and it's already dragging on longer than that. There are 23 Union states and 11 Confederate states. Well, on August 30th, now Fremont was a massive abolitionist, a radical Republican. So he had lots of powerful allies in D.C., and he's famous. So what he does, Missouri is what we call a border state. There's Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, where they don't join. They're slavery states, by the way. Slavery is a big part of their states, but they don't join the Confederacy. Now, they don't join the Union either. They're not like fighting for the Union. Hey, we're all with you, but they refuse to join the Confederacy. Lincoln is like, oh my gosh, we got to keep these border states intact. Well, Fremont goes to Missouri and says, you know what, that's it. I'm emancipating all the slaves here and of any residents that are disloyal, and I'm going to shoot anybody that we see that's not on our side. Holy smokes, there are laws in place for this stuff, and Lincoln is kind of freaking out when Fremont does this. He's overstepping his bounds, right? And by the way, so here's the map of what it looks like then. You see how important Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware in green there are to the north. If they lose those, first of all, the populations of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware equaled half of the rest of the Confederacy. If they join the Confederacy gets a 50% boon. In manufacturing and population, et cetera, and plus Maryland, for example, here's right, it surrounds DC. Okay, with Virginia and Maryland, they've got DC surrounded. So Lincoln's like, we got to keep the border states happy. They don't have to join the Union, they just can't join the Confederacy, right? So Lincoln's response, he tells Fremont, you got to take this back, this emancipation of slaves there, even though Lincoln will later do his own. Okay, he says they're not ready for that. You got to do it. Fremont says, look, I'm not going to do this unless you openly tell me, President. You have to come out in public and say, I told Fremont to not do that. Well, Lincoln says, okay, your answer just received expresses a preference on your part that I should make an open order for the modification, which I very cheerfully do. Makes it public. Well, there's public outrage in the North against Lincoln, the radical Republicans. And remember, Lincoln agrees with him. He hates slavery, but he knows that acting too radically is actually going to backfire, and the border states are going to join the Confederacy. So there's public outrage against Lincoln in the North, not just in the South, but in the North, right? And Lincoln, Lincoln had connections everywhere. He's constantly surveying the land. He's got allies in Kentucky, right, his birth state. His birth states, and Kentuckians, when John C. Fremont did this, Kentucky was threatening to join the Confederacy. Okay, so look at what Lincoln, and in fact, Lincoln is reported to have said once, I really hope that we have God on our side, but I have to have Kentucky. Okay, so Lincoln says, look, I'm going to tell him, despite all the heat I'm going to get here in the North, despite all the vitriol I'm going to be victim to here in the North, I'm going to tell him to revoke his proclamation. He said, I was so assured, I'm reading in the middle of the page here, is to think that the very arms that they had given to Kentucky to defend itself would be turned against us. And I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as the whole game. Kentucky gone, they wouldn't hold Missouri, right? So the stuff that's happening in Missouri with Fremont would actually have them lose Kentucky, and then they'd lose Missouri, nor is, I think, Maryland. Then all these against us joining the Confederacy, the job on our hands is too large, and we should as well consent to separation once, including the surrender of this capital. Well, Lincoln makes Fremont do this because he sees the picture bigger than Fremont does. As a result of the modification that he demands that Fremont do, Kentucky legislature abandoned neutrality and called for 40,000 volunteers for the Union, and Missouri and Delaware and Maryland all remain neutral. Okay, if they lose Maryland and Missouri and Kentucky, the war is over, and we have a Confederate States of America today and a United States of America. Okay, Lincoln knew this better than his counterparts because he had that phronesis, he had that practical wisdom, and he was always surveying. Okay, remember our formula here: preservation of institutional integrity, physical and principled sense, law of the situation. The law of the situation was you lose Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, you lose the war. So what does practical wisdom tell you to do? That equals effective leadership. Now, here's what we talked about earlier, guys, in closing. That you and I, we need to define what institutional integrity or purpose is for your agencies. Lincoln knew what it was. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Okay, in a nutshell. Okay, and a physical integrity for him was winning the war. You had to win the war, or else the American experiment in democracy in a constitutional republic is a laughingstock, and then the whole earth loses that. Then you have to manage subordinates to that purpose. Okay, you have to check your motivations. I'm speaking to all of us now. Am I doing this so I lord authority over this person, the subordinate of mine, or am I doing it because I actually think it's going to help us better preserve institutional integrity? And by the way, right now during transition, we need to be able to define what a physical preservation of our agencies are. We have to be able to say, here's why we deserve this budget. Here's why we deserve this many FTEs. This is something very real that Lincoln faced, that you and I face, right? Surround yourself with talent. And then when you surround yourself with talent, build trust. And then you're going to have to embrace and manage conflict. Something Lincoln did with all these very talented people in his cabinet was he embraced conflict, healthy conflict, and then mitigated negative, toxic conflict. Okay. And then finally, you've got to change and adapt. You've got to adapt like he did with Fremont. You've got to align any change that you have to the purpose of preserving institutional integrity, however you guys define that. And then you have to be constantly scanning the environment. Part of what made Lincoln so good is that he had connections in Missouri, Kentucky, because those were he came from what was then the far West. Okay. And he would get information. Hey, tell me what's happening out there. He did kind of a reconnaissance so they could manage change and adapt appropriately. And then finally, cultivate phronesis. Now, in our last minute here, your question should be, well, how do I cultivate phronesis? Well, this is how, okay? First of all, you need to understand and appreciate, those that are hearing this, that the public service's constitutional role. You need to understand that you are working in institutions that serve a societal purpose, and even that America's constitutional framework does not work without its public administration, which is what you are a part of, including into its states. It's why we're a federal system, okay? The second thing I would say is process experiences. Because to say that Lincoln possessed phronesis, Aristotle would say that phronesis, or this practical wisdom, was young men, so to speak. Remember, he is speaking to men at this time. Aristotle says young men didn't have it because you only get it through experience. Well, Lincoln had no executive experience. How could he be an effective president? He was never an administrator. He was really never a manager of anything. How did he do it? Well, one of the things that Lincoln did is every experience that he went through, he retained it and tried to glean some lesson for it. Look at the bottom of this quote here by this historian, Richard Carradine. Every material object or moral entity conveyed to him an object lesson. He never just went through difficult times in his life or challenges without internalizing. You and I need to consciously do that, and then finally deliberate with others. And what I mean by deliberate with others is actually as Lincoln did with his cabinet, Seward and Stanton in particular, you need to process with others to expedite, if that's the right word, our wisdom. The other thing I would say about deliberating with others is deliberate, as we've done here today, with history and current events. Lincoln loved American history. He loved it with a passion. He loved the stories of Washington, including, crossing the Delaware, and he loved, he had a very Hamilton-esque view of America. Loved Jefferson because of the Declaration of Independence. Well, Lincoln read voraciously, even when he, as a kid, when he didn't have much access to books. He would do whatever he could during any break, when he's plowing fields or chopping wood, to read history and other things, philosophers, and then he would process that. That expanded his experience, gave him experience beyond his years and his actual experience, so to speak. And that's why I still believe if you and I are going to cultivate our phronesis, if we're going to increase our practical wisdom, why we can't ignore history or other role models, and we can learn from them like Lincoln did and like we've done today. So this is why Abraham Lincoln is still worthy of emulation, and I think is a role model for you and me and those of us in the public sector in particular. I think for all people, but in particular in the public sector. Okay. Now I want to tell you, 3 weeks from today, if my math is correct, is our next off-the-shelf series. You guys, we'll be sending out a couple of things, a link to this. One, mental wellness in trying times, which we're facing. This is going to include an interview with a mental health professional or professionals from Bloom Coast Hale. So you're going to get an appointment for that, but you're also going to be asked to submit some questions so that our experts can answer some of those questions. We've been asked to do more on this kind of topic from your feedback, and so we want to respond to that. But so look for those. I'm really excited for that webinar. I think it's going to be very, very useful and very, very relevant. So anyway, you guys, that's a quick and dirty expose maybe, or exposition of Lincoln as a role model for us. But let me know, by the way, I'm going to exit here and stay on if you have any questions or anything about Lincoln or leadership or anything else. But if there aren't any, then thank you everybody for your time, and please, happy Thanksgiving. Be safe, be well, be smart about this virus, and keep yourselves healthy and well. Thanks, everybody.